Welcome back to the Straight Talk podcast. I am your host, Tim Adams, and today we're going to be talking about your spiritual walk as a pastor and a ministry leader. I think it oftentimes gets taken for granted that the sheer burden and schedule demands on you pastors and ministry leaders can be such that it's hard to find the time, the energy, the commitment, the discipline, and if we're being brutally honest, the desire to find that time to connect with God regularly. And I wanted to talk briefly about not only what does your walk look like, how is it that you connect with God regularly, but also the idea that I think we get so caught up in the proper way to have devotional time with God every single day, and how that can actually damage your relationship with God. So let me unpack that a little bit. Growing up, my mom was adamant that we, as her children, learn to develop this daily routine where we would get up super early in the morning. We would spend an hour in prayer and reading the Bible, maybe reading a devotional book, something like that, but something very rote. And that would lead to amazing interactions with God and revelation and clarity and, good juju. And I want to be clear, I'm not discounting that at all. That has worked for scores of people, probably millions of people throughout the history of the world, if not billions. I do think that there are some times where having a rote routine can put so much pressure on you that when you miss a day or you fall out of that habit, that is a clear-cut, open doorway for guilt and shame to be poured on you by our enemy. And we really need to be careful about those doorways those doors that we open up. Something that I have found works for me is to not be tied to a specific routine. I agree that there should be a regular time in the given day, but I don't think that always has to be early in the morning. I think for a lot of people, it generally works out better because once you get up and start the day, you start eating breakfast, you start getting ready to leave for work, you get to work and you get hammered, you come home and all you want to do is just crash and then you fall asleep. So generally I think in the early morning can work best for most people, but that's certainly not true for everybody. And I personally believe that God is large enough of an entity to meet us where we're at whenever and wherever we turn back towards Him. And for me, the practice that I generally try and follow is I'll get up in the morning. Usually I'll be up before my wife, and I'll make my coffee. So I'm very particular about my coffee. And for me, coffee is an experience. And sometimes I will read the Bible. Sometimes I will journal. Sometimes I will read a book. Sometimes I will just sit quietly and reflect. Sometimes I will pray. I don't tie myself to a particular discipline because God is dynamic and I am dynamic, and I have experienced God in so many different ways because I'm not putting him in a box and basically taking him out every morning for an hour or 30 minutes or whatever it is and saying, okay, this is the time that I have for you, so go. And, give me the revelation or the clarity or the understanding or the word that you have for me today. What I like to do is, before I do whatever it is I'm going to do, I ask God what I should do. I think so often we have a tendency to complicate problems. And instead of we come up with an issue or an obstacle or a problem, and we immediately jump over the easy solutions, and we start troubleshooting about halfway through a troubleshooting process. And, our lives are complicated enough. I don't think we need to go out of our way to make them more complicated. So I think the more often we engage God in our daily lives, in terms of the little situations that we find ourselves in, the interactions with other people, the alone time that we may have on our commute, whatever that looks like. Maybe you've got a situation where a coworker or a ministry partner or another pastor is just venting on you. Maybe you've got a church member that's coming in and going through a really tough time. Whatever it is, I'm surprised in my conversations with pastors how often I'll mention, so what does God say about the situation? And they look at me like, what? I'm like, well, didn't you ask God about, what you should do? And it strikes me that a lot of pastors seem to have this wall between them and God, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think a lot of it has to do with this spirit of the age of busyness, this idea that we're just so busy that we don't have time for everything, and amidst that hustle and bustle, it's easy to lose track of what really should be our first and foremost priority, and that is our relationship with God. If you think about going on a plane ride, they do the safety briefing. They always tell you to put your own mask on first, in the case of a depressurization, and then help others, particularly children, with their masks. You're no good to anybody if you're unconscious. And I think that can apply to, and that does apply to all aspects of our lives, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. If you're checked out, or if you're taken out by the enemy or by the world, you're no good to anybody, really. You may have memorized all of the right answers. You may have them just ready to go. But funny thing is, people have this innate ability to spot fakeness and insincerity. And it's really important for us, if we're going to build strong communities of faith, if we're going to build that deep, meaningful relationship with each other that I talked about in the last episode, then we really do need to stop being fake with each other. And the only way that we can do that and be in a emotionally safe place to do that is we've got to get healed. We have to identify the wounds that we've taken, the messages that we heard from that those wounds delivered, those agreements that we made, and the vows that we made because of all of that. And the cool thing is that healing is available. But we have to go through that process. And I think a lot of us fundamentally understand that that healing is there, that restoration is there. It's being offered by God all the time, but we're just afraid of the pain. We know the pain when that wound was received, and we don't want to go through that again. We have built all of these masks, all of these poses, all of this false self around us to protect us from having to go through that pain again. The ironic thing is that which is laid down in pain can only be accessed in pain. And one of our biggest defenses against getting hurt again is really investing in that spiritual walk. So, I mentioned earlier that being so adherent to a rote routine can actually do more damage. Let me unpack that a little bit, at least from the way that I see it. When you focus on what you should do, when it comes to external pressure. So what I mean by that is, let's say other people have expectations of us, and your pastors, there are expectations, right? So when you're trying to please other people and you're trying to meet those expectations that they all have, that can dramatically impact your devotional time, because you're not necessarily focused on what God has for you in that time so much as, I have to do this. It's almost like working out. When you work out because you're supposed to versus working out because you understand and desire the goal that you've set, whether that is to bulk up, to tone down, to lose weight, to be able to run a marathon, whatever your end goal is, you understand the importance of that regular adherence to the steps necessary to meet that goal. In terms of your spiritual walk, the context that we really should be thinking in is war and survival. Our connection with God is the one and only lifeline that we have that has been proven throughout time. We can see it over and over and over again in the Bible, to be the one thing worth investing in. And yet, we all struggle to make that practice a high enough priority that we do it more often than not. And I think that's the other important aspect of this, is this idea of grace. We're all we all fall short, right? That's what the Bible says. We're gonna fail in terms of meeting that goal every single day, or 3 times a week, or whatever you decide you want to do. But how we handle that failure is important, because if we let it rule us, then we will fail more and more often, because we start to believe this lie that We can't do it. We can't meet the minimum requirements, so why even try? And that's some dangerous thinking right there. Whereas if we turn around and we say, you know what? Yeah, I didn't worship or I didn't have my time with God today, but I'll have it with him tomorrow, because God is graceful, he is merciful, and he extends grace to me, so I should extend grace to myself as well. And then once you start extending grace to yourself, that's not an excuse to slack off. It should be a motivation to continue more often than not to meet the goal, right? That's fuel to say, I don't like how this makes me feel, so I'm going to take the steps necessary to accomplish the goal that I've set forth, whatever that is. Is that a bulletproof way of doing it? Certainly not. But over time, what happens is you build resilience. And that can help you in all manner of aspects in your life. Resilient people, at least in my experience, one of the key attributes that sets them apart from other people is how they respond to their failures. Do they get back up and keep going? Or do they let that failure define their lives? And the only place that we should be taking our question of who we are and what we are and those deep questions that we all wrestle with, the only safe place to take those is to God. Because he's the only one with the pedigree, the authority, the right to answer those questions. A lot of times I have heard people talk about that living water that Christ talks about to the Samaritan woman. And he describes it as, once you drink from this water, you'll never thirst again. And she kind of jokes with him and says, well, give me that water now so I don't have to keep coming out here to the well. Now, without having been there, we don't know if that was a sarcastic response or if that was sincere and she was taking him literally. I think that there's enough evidence that we could go either way with it. But if we take those deep soul-searching questions to God, when he answers those, as only he can, there is a deep settledness that those answers provide, because he speaks exactly what it is that you need to hear and only what you need to hear in that moment. And when the troubles come, when the storms of life start hitting you, that is where those answers that God gave you, those revelations, that clarity, the words that he speaks to you, that's where that really comes in handy. And if you're not somebody who journals in your times with God, I'm not suggesting that become a regular practice. I personally believe that it's really beneficial, but at the very least, I think it's important that you have a journal so that when God speaks to you, you record those words for exactly that purpose that I talked about a moment ago. When the storms of life hit you, those words, those situations, those times when God speaks to you, and you record them, you can go back over those. You can see how he has spoken into your life and into your heart. And oftentimes what you'll find is the very words that he spoke not only were applicable to the situation that you were in, that time that you were in, but is also applicable to what you're going through now. And I can't promise you that, but I can promise you that God will always show up when we commit to spending time with Him. He will always give you more than you need. Even if you don't understand it, that's what's happening in the moment. I think also, in conclusion, I think it's also important to understand that when you commit to furthering your walk, your journey with God, not only does He always show up, but He shows up in unexpected ways. And you learn things about God's personality that I think can only be learned when you spend time with Him, just like a normal person. You'll find that there are times that He's playful. There are times He's sarcastic. There's times that He's very serious. And there's other times where He's extremely merciful and loving and kind. And I don't want you guys to cheat yourselves out of experiencing that. I think it's very easy for church members to look at their pastors and say, oh, well, they've got it all together. Oh, of course they have a daily routine where they spend time in the Word. How else could they come up with all these sermons and Bible messages and crazy thoughts and, whatever it is? But I think it's very easy for us to forget that pastors are humans first. They struggle with many of the same things we struggle with. And one of those things, I believe, based on my own experience, is that the faith journey, in particular, can be extremely taxing on pastors. And I don't think you guys should feel ashamed. I don't think you should feel guilty. I think you need to understand that that's normal. And it's okay to walk through that. And please don't take me out of context here. What I'm not saying is it's okay to question your theology and say, or your faith, and say, well, I'm going to go this way because that's my path that I'm choosing. This goes back into what we talked about in the last episode, ego versus leadership. You always want to make sure that you are following God, not following what you want, but following God. I can tell you from personal experience, it is always better than even you can imagine if you are constantly realigning yourself to God's plan. Because when you follow your own path, even if it's with good intentions, we know where that road leads. It's going to lead to pain. It's going to lead to suffering. It's going to lead to more wounding, and ultimately death. And that's not always just physical death. That could be emotional death, spiritual death, just bad places. So hopefully that wasn't too preachy. I don't like coming across like I know everything, because I'm on this journey too. And what I'm really trying to build is a community around this idea of just supporting each other and supporting your fellow pastors. And to that end, I again encourage you to find us on Stay Touch. We have a whole community there. that we're trying to build. And if you're not familiar with Stay Touch, it's an extremely versatile and growing secure messaging platform. And don't get hung up on secure messaging because it sounds like it's really one-dimensional. It's really not. I don't have the time to go into all the details, but I do encourage you guys to consider sitting through a demo with the developer. It's pretty amazing what this thing can do. Yeah, all that information is downstairs, and look forward to seeing you there. And until next time, God bless, and keep fighting the good fight.